So it gives me really great pleasure to welcome David to this memorial lecture on how to invigorate the multilateral system. David has dedicated his entire life to humanitarian assistance and relief in some of the worst conflict zones in the whole world. Prior to working with the United Nations, he worked with NGOs such as Save the Children Fund, and he spent nearly 20 years working for the UN in a range of important leadership positions. He pioneered important work on the relationship between development and peace building, and led the development of the UN Humanitarian Assistance Program in many countries around the world, including Somalia, Rwanda, Liberia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and Iraq. In 1992, he was, together with his wife, named New Zealander of the Year by the New Zealand Herald. He then went into politics. He won the Mount Albert by-election and into the House of Representatives, and became a member of the New Zealand Parliament for the Labour Party from 2009 to 2018. He was elected leader of the party in 2016 and was appointed, and then went on again to join the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission in South Sudan in 2021. In this position, he was widely adjudged in UN circles to be more successful in his role than any of his predecessors. He's worked with warlords, politicians, and a wide variety of NGOs to bring sustainable peace to many parts of the world. He's extraordinarily well placed, therefore, to talk to us on how to invigorate the UN as an effective multilateral system. So without any further ado, Dave, over to you, and welcome to all. He's coming to us from Aruba in the Caribbean, so thank you for being there for us, and we can imagine being there with you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you very much for the honour of presenting the lecture for this year and being the ninth person. As Kevin said, what I'll try and do is speak for about 30-35 minutes, so that we have a bit more of an interactive kind of a lecture, and we can also put forward our own thoughts and ideas and questions, and obviously disagreements as well. This is a pretty broad topic that Kevin gave me, invigorating the multilateral system, and of course it's a topic that will fill entire libraries, or has filled entire libraries, in terms of how people can and how we can improve the UN system in particular. And I want to look more specifically at one of the oldest multilateral interventions, which is peacekeeping, and take a bit more of a closer look at that. And I want to do it through looking through the eyes of what I just came from, which was to head the UN's peacekeeping operation in South Sudan. I do this after having completed 4.5 years of heading UNMISS, which is what they call the mission there. The appointment gave me a pretty rare opportunity to see the multilateral system in operation, both in an active war zone and in a post-conflict setting as well. Across the world, as many of you I'm sure will know, there are 10 peacekeeping missions and other specialist missions, employing 90,000 troops from 120 countries. And at one level, this is a remarkable international commitment to peace. On another, it's rather expensive at $6.45 billion US, in the dollars that I mentioned over the next few minutes will be in US dollars. And it's in some respects, it's a large, clunky way to responding to conflict. And often some of their interventions of some of these troops aren't quite as altruistic as they seem on the surface. My presentation today, therefore, will try and focus on some of the ways, more practical, I guess, of improving that system to create peace on the ground amongst those people who suffer the effects of conflict. And I'll address this in 3 parts. First, by looking at what I know best, which is the peacekeeping operation in South Sudan. I've been out of it for a year now, so I'm hoping that that'll give me sufficient distance to be able to reflect on not only what happened, but also be a little self-critical about what happened as well. Second, what were the key challenges and limitations that South Sudan threw up, but that are also applicable to more broadly to other peacekeeping operations in the world. And then lastly, what can we do to make peacekeeping and other missions more effective in securing peace? So first, just to start with, as I said, to hone in on South Sudan and the UN's operation in South Sudan. And to start with, let me just give you a very short potted history of South Sudan. It's the world's youngest country. It gained its independence in 2011. So it's only 11 years old, slightly older than the Baxter Memorial Lecture of 9 years. It came about having fought a war for nearly 40 years. It was an independence war, the South versus the North, the South being Christian, largely African, and the North being Muslim and largely Arab. Not purely, but certainly that was the broad distinction. South Sudan is a country of 12 million people. It's spread over an area the size of France, with the Nile River bisecting the middle of the country. It's got oil wealth in the north of the country, right on the border between its old nemesis Sudan and itself, and the border is still disputed, despite the fact that they separated countries. They didn't quite get the border right, and that has largely a lot to do with the oil wealth that's found there. It's a country that was devastated by these generations of war. And let me give you three quick examples of what I mean. 350 kilometers of tarmac road is all that South Sudan has in terms of tarmac road in the country. The rest of it is dirt road, and during the rainy season, they're completely impassable. To truck supplies from the capital, Juba, to the north, a town called Bentiu, is a distance of 1,000 kilometers, and it generally took between 10 and 14 days in the dry season, not the rainy season. It closed in the rainy season. And female literacy rate is below 30%. It's around about 25% of the population is literate, and for males it's a bit higher, but not significantly. So this is a country that devastated by war, and it's felt the effects, and it starts from an incredibly low bar to start with. 2 years after gaining its much lauded and celebrated and hard-fought independence, it collapsed into civil conflict amongst itself. And from 2013 to 2018, 5-year period, the UK School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene estimated that 380,000 people died prematurely because of the war, either from the effects of war or the indirect effects of war. Sexual violence was carried out on a horrific scale, and 1/3 of the population fled their homes, 4 million people. 2 million crossed over the borders into neighboring countries, and 2 million were displaced internally. So in 2017, in January 2017, when I took up the role of the head of of UNMISS, this was the predicament, the situation that I was introduced to at that time. And what was the international response? Well, UNMISS was actually first created as a support to peace building and to state building. It was supposed to be a very positive UN mission, but after it collapsed into conflict, it very quickly became a mission that was more dedicated to protecting civilians than anything else. The numbers increased to 15,500 troops from about 60 odd different countries. The main contingents from Africa and Asia, although interestingly, we had a British company there for nearly 2 years, an engineering company. It's their first excursion out to work with the UN since the Bosnia War. about 2,000 police from different countries, and around 2,000 civilian staff. It made it the largest UN mission in the world. It still is. It's a rather dubious honor. It's certainly not an honor. It's more a reflection of failure on the country itself. So all around about 20,000 personnel spread across the country in 17 different bases, and a cost of $1.2 billion to the international community. But that wasn't the extent of, that isn't the extent of the expenditure in the country, and there's more than around $1.1 billion was spent by the humanitarian actors in South Sudan. Probably another 200 or 300 million on top of that in development, to make a conservative total being spent annually in South Sudan of $2.5 billion. But that's 4 times, maybe 5 times larger than the entire South Sudan's budget. And I say possibly, or I'm dubious about the numbers, simply because their budget seldom gets produced, and the expenditure on the budget has never been documented since 2011. So we never quite know what the country has actually been spending itself and on what. All missions, all peacekeeping missions operate according to an agreed Security Council mandate. And ours, there's no exception. It was 13 pages long. And one keen observer at one point started to add up the tasks that were included in our peacekeeping mission, and noted that it came to more than 150 separate tasks that we were supposed to be carrying out, which they're all important, they're all well-intentioned, but they were not conducive to enabling a mission to align itself along a particular path. And so one of the first jobs that was left for me was to translate that mandate into something that was actually a little more manageable and more understandable by the people working in the mission. And really, it all boiled down to the fact that our job was twofold. One was to build durable peace, and the other was to protect civilians. And the more that you built durable peace, the more that civilians were protected. And the less peace that there was, the more that civilians needed to be protected, and the more our emphasis and our focus went in that direction. I don't want to go on about South Sudan, but I just wanted to say, if we fast forward today from those violent days in the early part of 2017, there has now been a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire signed at the end of 2017. In 2018, there was an agreement, a peace agreement signed. And at the beginning of 2020, a transitional all-party government was formed, which was a remarkable turnaround and a really, I have to say, quite a humbling experience to be part of that transition from utter war and devastation to something where there was a lot more promise. Has the violence stopped there? No, it hasn't, but it has changed from more political, ethnic conflict to where heavy weaponry was deployed unmercifully on civilian populations, to more localized ethnic conflicts or tribal conflicts, all charged by the proliferation of light weapons across the country. So what are the lessons that we learned from this experience, and how can we look at these in more generally? My belief, how did this peacekeeping mission, did it succeed? Well, it depends on who you ask. It's my firm belief that hundreds of thousands of people would have died if it hadn't been for the fact that the UN peacekeeping presence was there in South Sudan. For example, in 2013, when war and conflict broke out, 200,000 people fled to our bases, and we opened the gates of our bases and let people come in and take refuge there. And it was a courageous decision. It wasn't my decision. It was before I arrived, but it certainly it was learning the lessons of Srebrenica and other places where that didn't happen, but where we opened the gates and allowed people to come in. Or certainly one of the most historic successes that the UN has ever had in its history, but something that very, very rarely gets talked about. Peacekeepers also provide a degree of stability right across the country, which allows others to operate. So NGOs, of which there are hundreds in South Sudan, both local and international, are much more confident about providing their services when there's a peacekeeping mission close by. And on a number of occasions, the UN has provided support to NGOs to enable them to continue to work. One of the things I learned quickly, and I think this applies to not only to South Sudan, but more broadly, is that the UN can provide good officers. It can provide the opportunities and the space for bringing leaders together to forge peace, but it's the regional players that have more clout and leverage to bring top political leaders together. And we've seen that with the Dayton Accord and other peace agreements more broadly across the world. And South Sudan is no exception. We assisted, got in behind, provided the space, provided the analysis, provided some of the lobbying. But our job, as the Secretary General said at the time, was always to lead from behind. And really, it was the regional players that brought together the parties that enabled that peace agreement to be finally signed. And ironically, the one person who probably did most to bring peace was President al-Bashir, who was the long-standing president of Sudan and is now indicted in a prison for war crimes in the Hague. So it was important for us to create the partnerships with regional players, and that's a fundamental prerequisite in order to be able to get peace. But for the UN to do it, it's a very very difficult thing to do as a leader in the process. However, at a subnational level, on a regional country across the country, where most people obviously live, the implementation of the peace agreement was best affected by the UN. And there were a multitude of meetings held after the peace agreement was signed, which brought together various factions, various militias that all came together to talk with each other. And I distinctly remember one of those meetings where two sides were sitting around the table, and one of the generals from one of the sides pointed to the other general at the other side and said, for the last 5 years, I've been trying to kill you, and you've been trying to kill me, and here we are sitting together talking about peace and how we move forward. I mean, it's a great day. It's one of those wonderful moments that you always want to sort of bottle it and keep it, because it's a terrific sort of thing that happened. But we hosted probably about 120 of those meetings across the country, bringing these different players together in similar fashion. They sat under countless meetings under trees and on plastic chairs, trying to encourage people to think differently. They didn't need very much persuasion. By the time 5 years of fighting had happened, they were all ready for peace. And I can outline many instances, as I said, where I think the UN has diverted at a local level conflict, or perhaps where the early arrival of peacekeepers and caused parties to pause to enable elders or tribal leaders to be able to talk and curtail what seemed to be inevitable bloodshed. But of course, there were dozens of other times when that didn't happen, or we were unable to arrive on time, or we were prevented from arriving because of we were blocked by various militias. And one of the, I guess, one of the most depressing aspects of this type of peace operation and on this type of scale is that instances where fighting erupts can always be measured and calculated by the body count or what actually happened. But what's never counted, of course, is the number of times where the intervention has prevented something from happening or calmed a situation and lives were saved. It's very difficult to count something that didn't happen. And I remember sitting down with the New York Times correspondent and saying to him, you know, we've just had this meeting where we've brought together these people from Tonge County, and as a result of that, there's no fighting. I said, you should do a story on that. And he said, what would the headline be? UN intervenes to maybe stop people from being killed, possibly. I said, well, you know, maybe you could think of something a little more imaginative than that. But it's a good story, but nobody wants to have a good story. Everybody wants to see a more tragic story, unfortunately. Another of the lessons is that maintaining the UN's respect as an impartial broker and ultimately commands the respect of the people is enormously important. Lose that credibility, and you basically your effectiveness and your ability to access population evaporates. The deployment of a Chapter 7 mandated peacekeeping operation is fine in theory, but seeing it from the point of view of the country involved, it's a sign of failure. Your country has failed to be able to look after itself. And your arrival is really an imposition on the country's sovereignty, and it's often seen like that, and taken rather poorly as a lack of pride and dignity. So trying to find that balance and being able to accept and work your way with local people is important. It's impossible to impose a peacekeeping operation, despite the Chapter 7 mandate, into a country like South Sudan. Even with 15,000 troops, we were up against 70 or 80,000 much more heavily armed government troops, and so our presence could never be dominant from the point of view of military prowess. It's always had to be as a result of respect and the respect that they saw us with. Another lesson that we learned from peacekeeping operations, and I think this has been adopted more generally across many of the other peacekeeping operations as well, is that you can protect effectively, but only if that is the expectation that your troops come into the theatre with. And we in South Sudan had three kind of callings of what we felt people needed, the troops needed to do. The first of all, they needed to be proactive. To be proactive, you need intelligence, you need good communications, you need good analysis of what's actually happening around the place in an extraordinarily complex environment. Second, and you need to be agile and nimble. You need to have the helicopters, you need to have the trucks, you need to be able to move from place to place to be able to get to areas quickly. And lastly, you need to be robust. You have to be prepared to take it to them to some extent. We had a wide range of different troops. One of the forces that we had were Mongolians, a company of Mongolians, and they were the par excellence, the most robust troops that I've seen. And give you one example. And there are a number of examples I could give you, but I mean, one example, there were at the time they were patrolling around a particular area in the north of the country in Benchu, and a number of young boys were being abducted, being kidnapped to be made part of the fighting groups that were there. The Mongolians came upon these one of the militias who had just kidnapped 16 boys, and they demanded that they let these boys go. And the head of the militia said that they weren't going to let them go. and that and said in English, if you don't move away, he said, I'm going to kill you. And the Mongolian, who also spoke a bit of English, said to me, you can kill me if you like, but you see that man over there with a machine gun, he's going to kill you and you and you and you. And so the best thing for you to do is to give up the boys, because we're not leaving without them. And after a little more argument and a little more argy-bargy, they walked off with 16, 13-year-olds, all very willing to go back to their families and their mothers. But the Mongolians would never have stepped down or stepped back. And you actually sort of need that. And interestingly, another aside, safety amongst peacekeepers is more guaranteed through robustness than it is through weakness, particularly right across Africa, but I think more generally. If you have a reputation for being robust and fearless, then you're respected. If you have a reputation for weakness, you're not respected, and you have far more chance of being shot or killed as a result of that. So that was one of the things that we pushed was as I say, robustness. But having commanders that are willing to do that, willing to step up, willing to be proactive, nimble, and robust is not easy. And I worked with 3 different commanders under me. 2 of them were excellent and made a huge difference. One was not so much the case. Our human rights monitoring is absolutely and utterly essential, and we did a huge amount of it. But monitoring itself is not enough. You have to form a relationship, because it's all very well calling people out after they've committed atrocities. It's something else to be able to work with these people, and sometimes they're very odious people that have got blood on their hands. But unless you change their behaviour, you're not going to be able to change future abuses. And it was very important that ultimately, as an international in an international operation, you can do so much protection through your human rights work, but ultimately it's going to depend on the country themselves to be able to look after their own people. And one of the things we put a lot of emphasis on, and I know this is the case in many other peacekeeping operations, is establishing the rule of law again, working with police, working with prison, the prison staff, to be able to make that effective as well. One of the things we did in the northern part and in the western part of South Sudan is had what they call mobile courts. These were courts that were not permanently set up, but they were temporary. And we flew judges up from Juba to be able to hear cases in many of these locations. And I remember one of the, actually she was a Kiwi woman who was working with us, telling me that she was a lawyer and she was part of this program, standing there in court, and a young girl who had been gang raped by 4 different guys. Her case was being heard, and these 4 guys swaggered into court, very cocky, very arrogant, thinking that as per usual they were going to get off because nobody was willing to be able to testify. But the fact that this court was there, they walked in, they saw this girl standing there, they saw some of the witnesses that were around there as well, and their faces fell. And after the court case, they were sentenced between 4 and 13 years for this rape. The next day, or a few days later, when the next court case came about, there were 48 women standing outside the courtroom willing to give testimony on other cases. So it's providing that opportunity for countries and people to be able to try their own and implement their own means of controlling that sort of violence is much better than a UN peacekeeping mission. But providing that stimulus to get it going is part of our job. Another lesson, the sanctions, do they work? Yes, they do. But ironically, what I found was, particularly in South Sudan, was the threat of sanctions works far better than the actual sanction itself. Once the sanction's been imposed, you fired your bullet, it's been done, and the individual then looks for ways in which they can get around the sanctions. The threat of sanctions is much more important. Arms embargoes have worked to some extent, although once you've implemented an arms embargo, you have to follow up and monitor the movement of arms, because otherwise they will come in through all sorts of back doors. The engagement of the Security Council is absolutely and utterly critical, certainly for our purposes. Their reach and their gravitas are very important, but only if it's unified. We were very lucky in this regard. We had some excellent work with the Security Council. I kept them I spoke to them at least 4 times a year, visited them at least twice a year, individually as well as collectively. And they saw South Sudan as an area where they could have agreement, despite the fact that there were other agendas being run in other places in the world where there were great rifts between the two, between different parties on the Security Council. It's extraordinarily important that the Security Council is not denigrated, is not talked down, because at some point or other it's going to be needed, and it might not be needed for Ukraine, but it might be needed for Mali or a South Sudan or a Central African Republic, where it actually makes an enormous amount of difference. So the world needs a functioning, effective Security Council, and I can go into more detail about that, what they did with us and for us, but I use them a lot as part of my role. The UN needs to be more integrated, and how many times have we heard that? More coordinated. In so many countries, conflict, and certainly the case of South Sudan, was the greatest impediment to development is conflict. The poverty and hunger and the lack of development that I witnessed was really derived from ongoing fighting and wars. And yet our international system often focuses more attention not on the root causes, but dealing with the symptoms. So resolution, let me give you an example. We used to, as I said, many times we would meet with militias or groups under trees. We would forge a peace agreement. Each side would go away with swearing that they would stop their fighting, and within 7 or 8 months, or whatever, they would be back fighting again. Meanwhile, they would attack each other, burn each other's homes, burn down the health facilities, the schools, whatever else, as part of that conflict. And then you'd have aid agencies going in after that and rebuilding everything that was destroyed. And the cycle continued over and over and over and over. It's been continuing for 40 years in South Sudan. Riek Machar was one of the leaders. Who is one of the leaders of in South Sudan. Once said, "You look after the people, and we'll look after the war." And it shows the depth of dependence on the international organizations to provide for the people while they carry on without any responsibility or care for their own people. And that mentality has been transposed across now into the government themselves. And we're not seeing nearly as much responsibility being taken as should do. We kicked off to try and bring those different parts of the UN together, a trust fund whereby we looked at a particular area where there was conflict occurring, brought about the resolution, and then worked very closely with the UN aid organizations to come in behind that resolution and support it. So, for example, up in a village called Koch in the north, and this is one very, very simple example. We said, yes, we would help them, but first of all, they needed to resolve their situation. They came to a resolution, and so aid agencies went in, they built roads that connected markets together. The next step was to build a school. Both sides wanted a secondary school. the secondary, we said yes, there'll be a secondary school, but it'll only be one secondary school for both groups. So both sides will have to send their kids along to the same secondary school where they're going to have to mix together as they do and play football together and sit in the classroom together. And saying to build forge those links between the two different warring communities. We also put a peacekeeping operation in the town itself for a number of months to try and provide that platform for all that to work. Now, where you were able to bring the political part of the UN together with the humanitarian, the development, and the peacekeeping part of the UN, then you have much better opportunities to build a more sustainable way forward. And this trust fund, which is now more than $100 million strong, is starting to do that in a way that hasn't been tried before. It's met with some resistance from some agencies, but it's, I believe, the way forward into the future. But the idea that somehow it's humanitarian assistance, which is the answer, persists. And there was a very interesting, and I don't know if many of you saw it, exchange between David Beasley, the director of the World Food Programme, and Elon Musk that happened at the end of last year, where Beasley challenged some of the world's richest people to put in money to solve world hunger. And Musk came back and said, well, give me a strategy. Don't just ask me for money. How are you going to do it? And Beasley came back and said, well, look, you know, what we're going to do is we've got the facilities, we've got the staff, we've got the transport, we'll do it. Not exactly what I would call a strategy, but the assumption really was that WFP had an accurate estimation of food needs, knew where to obtain food if it had the money, could transport it, and it could deliver in times of need, and therefore was all it needed really was rich people to put their hand in their pocket. You can understand the motivation behind David Beasley, but at the same time, Elon Musk's question was a good one. So you deliver this food, and it's saying it is possible, and it resolves the hunger for the moment, but what about 3 months down the track? And the question I would ask is, what about Elon Musk putting more of his money towards the woefully underfunded political directorate of the UN, which is doing such an important amount of work, which is unseen, a lot of it, but is stopping conflict from happening, or perhaps bringing people together. Maybe that's it's more permanent than just. I'm not saying just, but people need food, obviously, but focusing on the symptoms rather than the causes. So basically, I guess I'm going to finish because I've gone over my time, Kevin. I've got other things that I'd like to say, but let me try and wrap it up. I guess I came away from South Sudan in some respects, and I think this applies to a lot of other places as well, is that keep the goals meaningful and realistic. We may not like that person in power. We might be able to point the finger at some of the things that they've done in the course of their career, but there's a lot of talk about needing to overthrow or move person on or whatever. That's pretty unrealistic, and the vacuum that often results is worse than what the situation that you have at the moment. Sometimes just maintaining stability is a pretty reasonable achievement, and then you wait for the time when the time is right to be able to move that on further. And I think what peacekeeping in South Sudan was able to start creating that place, that space of stability by which others are able to operate and to work on. I mean, I worked in Sierra Leone and Liberia at a time when people's hands were being cut off for voting, and other atrocities were carried out. That was a generation ago, and one generation further on, they're certainly not paradigms of development, but they have moved on and are peaceful, largely peaceful countries where people have got an opportunity. And sometimes just establishing that stability and just establishing that space at least gives people the respite to get on with their lives. Because at the end of the day, people in South Sudan, their life is not dominated by government. It's dominated by what's around them in their own small village. And giving them that space at least provides them with some opportunity to move on. And that's, I think, what a peacekeeping operation can do. So let me stop there, and I very much welcome their thoughts and comments. And I hope it wasn't too specific on South Sudan, but I didn't fix the entire multilateral system, but some very practical, I hope, suggestions. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you, David, and thanks for all of you who are watching. If you want to ask a question, please do so in the chat, addressing it to me and David directly. You've done exactly what we wanted you to do, David. You've given us a very hands-on account of what it's like on the ground to build stability, create at least minimal, workable pieces of peace, and integrate the human rights and development and peace-building agendas together in the face of all of the kinds of adversities that you're talking about. And you did a brilliant job, and in a way you provided a good example, I think, of what's absolutely necessary for a good peacekeeping operation, and one I hope that is being picked up by the Department of Political Affairs and others in relation to lessons learned, because I think you did a good job, because you focus your attention on minimalist objectives which had maximal effects, and I think that was really an important part of it. I've got a question there. Kingsley just said thank you for a fascinating and very comprehensive presentation and the wonderful work for peace. Is there anybody that would like to ask a question? One question just to get the ball rolling from me would be, in terms of the current state of the Security Council and its paralysis over Ukraine and so forth, I mean, what's your feeling about, the veto power and the central role of the P5? And did the P5 always act in unison with you in relation to the Sudan, or were there times when they threatened to kind of pull the plug if you didn't do what they wanted you to do?
I think let me answer it in two ways. First of all, taking your second part first. One of the most useful things that happened when I was there was that we had a visit from the Security Council, and this is something that the Security Council is doing. They organise collective visits, all 15 members, and I think when they came out, there was 12 out of the 15 were at an ambassador level. Came out to South Sudan, spent a day, and we organised this day with them. They met with the president, they met with the head of the opposition, they met with various civil society groups as part of that day, and they got a taste for the complexity of what was happening and what needed to happen. And there was an enormous degree of commonality of view that originated from that from that meeting, and that reverberated over the next year. Each time I talked to them, it was like talking to a friend, because they were there and they were able to talk about what do we need to do? Do we need to bring Kenya in? Is Uganda playing its role? Do we need? It leveraged my position tenfold by having that together. But South Sudan was also a rather unstrategic place. It didn't have much strategic significance for the big players, the P5, so much. And so they were able to agree on South Sudan. But unfortunately, some of the other divisions that were happening in other parts of the world that were affecting the Security Council often came into play. And in some respects, there was on occasion, actually rare occasions, but there would be a disagreement on something because of a disagreement that happened somewhere else. And so by principle, country X would disagree with country Y because of that happening. Arms embargo was one thing that there was no veto on, but there was an arms embargo brought through the Security Council in a straight vote, and was agreed upon. But I think China and Russia, and I think at the time South Africa and one or two other countries voted against it. So there was a bit of, but other than that, they were pretty much, we had a dream run compared to many. When it comes to the veto, and I mean, there's been lots talked about this, and I'm not the expert on this, but I do recall having a very intense discussion with the Russian, I think he was the deputy ambassador at the time, about the veto, and said, look, if we get our veto taken away from us, then that's fine, but you have to understand that from our point of view, is the West is far more dominant than what we can, so we'll always be voted down. And the veto is the only way in which we can preserve our position. And therefore, if we don't have a veto, then we will simply walk away, and we won't take as much notice of the Security Council as we do now. It was an interesting and very thoughtful response against something that I guess New Zealand and others have always said, that we need to expand the Security Council and remove the veto. I think it probably needs some very, very careful thought to see what sort of reaction is going to happen to what countries further down the track. And what we don't want to do is diminish the council and make it just a talk shop rather than a setter of international law going forward. So no answers there, Kevin. But
that's okay. And now I've got a whole bunch of questions here. Sorry, I didn't realize I'd forgotten that you can only send to one person at a time. So just to save David having his concentration interrupted, just send them directly to me. The first one is from Janie Benfield. Her question's around encouraging women to be involved in building peace. She's aware of the importance of women in Bougainville and bringing about peace. Was something similar possible in the South Sudan?
That was, we had a very, very active group that got together with women, and my feeling that it was that this was I mean, I think that it could be tapped further, put it that way. I was always, after being in Liberia, very, very interested in the way that the Liberian conflict came to an end, and it was largely the role of women at the peace talks in Nigeria that ended up really breaking the back of that conflict and bringing peace. And I think that there's more to be done in South Sudan. South Sudan women are very, are very much treated as the underdog. There's an enormous amount of work that's been going on, both by the UN, but also by some terrific NGOs who have been promoting women's role in peace. We did a lot of it on our radio, which one of the things this is too many things to mention, is that we have the UN has a radio station which reaches most parts of the UN. It's by far the best coverage, probably by 10 or 20 times better than the South Sudan media. So we had women on our radio station constantly talking about peace and trying to promote that. But I actually think that's where the future lies. But it's at a very underdeveloped point at the moment, and it needs to be developed further.
Okay, Richard Jackson sort of asked a question about how important is arms reduction and controls to making a more peaceful international system, and how can the P5 be held responsible for their central role in the arms trade and in the fueling of conflicts in the Sudan and elsewhere?
Well, ultimately, a lot of these armaments are manufactured in P5 countries, but they don't come to the South Sudan from Russia or whatever. They come via various other dubious means. And once the arms embargo was in place, they flew in late at night and, in unmarked Aleutians and wherever else. I mean, it still continued to happen, although I think the arms embargo did curtail a lot of the movement of military equipment. So I think embargoes work, but they need to be monitored, and the regions and the countries around South Sudan also need to be monitored as well, because there's also a trickle that goes across various borders into the country as well. So the ultimate manufacture of the weaponry is often derived from P5 countries, but the trafficking and the transport and the logistics and the blind eye and the greasing of palms, etc., that allow arms to move around happens at a much more diffuse level, and it's something that obviously needs to we need to keep a much closer eye on than what we've done, and also not be afraid to call it out when we see it. And that's one of the a lot of that is done by the panel of experts in the case of South Sudan. So it's outside of the mission, which is, I believe, where it should be. Because if I was calling the government out for bringing in arms, I would probably be not terribly welcome in the country the next day. Whereas a panel of experts who does it independently of me, where I don't have any real role, is the best way to do it. So an objective and a neutral way of doing that is the best way of keeping an eye on and monitoring that.
Okay, I think that answers Marion's question. I hope so, Marion. If not, just give me a heads up. Kingsley Baird said, concerning your story about the opposing sides coming together and agreeing to peace only to return to fighting months later, were their intentions for peace genuine, or were they only doing it so because there were rewards, perhaps buying time to improve their strategic position, etc.?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. The conflict happened on different levels in South Sudan, and I mean where it was the government, they call the government and the opposition. That level, which was what was happening in 2016, 2017, and parts of 2018. That was about bringing groups together, often in Sudan or in Nairobi or in Uganda or whatever, to try and bring that together, or sometimes Juba as well. But where it became less a kind of a national level and more of a local level, concerned us more than and meant often that's where most people were killed in those sort of local conflicts. So bringing people together, I believe that their intentions were genuine, that in probably 90% of the cases they came together with genuine intention to try and stop violence and stop conflict. But you have to understand, in all of these societies, and not just in South Sudan, I think it probably applies more generally to humankind, there's a revenge cycle that's there as well, and it's listed down and noted that the Mole killed 3 people, and the Dinka need to take revenge on those 3 people, and so any 3 people, as a result, will be killed because of that. And so that often will be underlying a lot of the discussions. And the second thing that's happened, and it's happened right across certainly the African continent, but elsewhere as well, is where you have a proliferation of weapons. Unfortunately, the tribal mechanisms and the traditional mechanisms of bringing people together and imposing order are undermined by the fact that young guys can pick up an AK-47 and go to the next village and shoot a few people and steal some cattle. And that happened on a number of occasions. Again, it generates the return to conflict. So I think the intentions were generally honest and honourable, but there's a lot of other noise going on around that can undermine it. my point about the way that we're doing things differently in a number of different locations in South Sudan now as a result of this trust fund is that the resolution takes place, and it basically what happens is they get the parties together, the reconciliation happens over a course of perhaps weeks, and then we get to understand what do they need, what would they like to see. I mean, a lot of the time it's water for cattle, or it's education, or it's health, or it's roads to get cattle to markets, and we'll say yes, we can do that, but only if the peace agreement stays in place. The moment that you guys go back to war again, that's off the table again. So there's a conditionality there. And having the agencies buy into that is I know it sounds incredibly common sense, but the UN humanitarian agencies usually not wanted to be part of any political agreement. They've wanted to be very, very independent, impartial, neutral, and independent. And having them buy into that provides enormous amount of ability to sustain and support a peace agreement, and then provide real concrete evidence of what reconciliation can do to a community, and how it can help. And I think it's just one of those things that I think is they call it the triple nexus. Of course, there's a name for it, which is basically reconciliation, political, humanitarian, and development all coming together. If we can do more of that, I believe there's a much better opportunity for us to secure that peace. Let me give you one example of that sort of thing happening. I mean, this is between a group called the Murle, who were very warlike cattle keepers against the Dinka in a place called Jonglei, an eastern part of South Sudan. Again, I think it relates to so many other places in the world. There was a road that linked Bor, where the Dinka lived, and the area where the Murle were situated, Pibor. We built the road between the two, or reconditioned the road. And suddenly, I remember being in Pibor and looking in the market. Goods were horrendously expensive, and there was virtually nothing for sale. We put the road through. Suddenly, there were goods in the market. The prices had dropped by 3 or 4 times for what they were. People were able to buy pots and pans and beds and basic goods. And the Murle, who were cattle keepers, were trucking their cattle down the road to the big market that was happening in Bor, and selling their cattle for much better prices. And suddenly there was this realization that this just making that connection between these two warring groups had enormous amount of economic benefit for both sides. And it's that sort of linking peace with economic development and other opportunities, which kind of cements and solidifies what can happen. So just leave you that very concrete example. But it was a terrific thing to see these Murle, who were killing each other just a few months earlier, suddenly selling their cattle in the local market and getting good prices.
Tony,
sure, the farmers in New Zealand would recognise that.
That's right. Tony says, has the number of peacekeeping forces been scaled down in South Sudan since independence, or since you terminated your mission there?
This is a very interesting question. When I left, I was aiming to bring it down by 2,500. What I was trying to do was that we can bring the troops down and move some of the money that was being spent on troops across to some of the other work that we're doing, like the work that I was telling you about. I thought we would be able to be much more flexible. This is one of the great frustrations, certainly I had, and I know other representatives have, and peacekeeping operations have as well, is that trying to reduce the number of troops. The biggest obstacle I had of that was actually our own people in New York. because they had to go to the countries who were contributing troops and say to them, look, thanks a lot, but we don't need you anymore. And so next year we'd like you to pull your troops out. And nobody really wanted to do that. And while money was coming in and while there was money available for troops, nobody wanted to downsize. And my feeling was it was very important to downsize. One, because it freed up money for other countries around the world. Two, because what I hoped was that some of that money would be able to be moved into operations and be able to make us more effective, lighter, smaller, and much more effective. And three, what it would do, and from a political point of view, was it sent a sent a message to the government or the opposition groups: is if you're able to forge peace, then we're leaving. This is not a permanent structure. We are going to be going. And they kept on asking us to go. There wasn't a day that went by that people saying, well, you're unnecessary, you should get going. The biggest impediment to that, as I say, was the structural institutional problems within the UN itself of trying to downsize. I think it was a wasted opportunity. I think it's still coming down, but I think it's been slowed by the bureaucrats.
Okay, got a great question here from Alan Jackson. The late Princess Diana called out the use of landmines, and there was popular support for a position and pressure to reduce landmine use, and of course the Landmines Convention. Can popular opinion be used to highlight and reduce other weapons in similar ways to landmines?
Yes, first on landmines, it was one of the most heavily polluted countries in the world for landmines. The landmine, the various agencies that were involved in that came under our rubric have done a remarkable job, really. This is, again, I used to say to these guys, the success for you is nothing happening. No explosions, no hands or arms or legs or whatever blown off. We never see your success because, of course, we only hear of your failure where areas weren't cleared and some young kids picked up a weapon or a piece of armament or munition and there was an accident. I would like to, obviously, there's a big call for arms being collected and forcibly being collected in some places. And there's a very simplistic argument which goes, if you can collect in all the weapons, then there'll be no weapons around, and it'll reduce the amount of killing that's going on across the country. It's very simplistic because what generally happens with arms collection is that somebody does it to somebody else, and generally there's a political motivation. You take the weapons away from your enemies or your possible rivals, and it puts you in a stronger position. And of course, nobody wants to give up their weapons, and so it really, what you need is peace and confidence and trust, and then from there, weapons naturally, as they are no longer needed and no longer are a currency for persuasion and theft and everything else, can come into play, but it can't happen the other way around. Mm-hmm. You can have a limited amount of arms being collected, but not in a meaningful way unless you have a peace agreement, unless you have reconciliation, and unless you have an ability for parties to trust each other and work together. You can't do it before that. So one has to follow the other. And I saw that too many times where it failed, unfortunately.
Great question here from Richard Jackson again. What do you think of the effect of the COVID pandemic's been on the UN's peacekeeping system? And why did the UN's attempt to call a global ceasefire at the height of the pandemic fail to gain traction? Was it a missed opportunity or a pipe dream?
Good questions. It affected us. Give me an example, and I know this happened in other places as well. We were monitoring very closely our personnel and our soldiers from if they got COVID or not. This is at the beginning of the pandemic when nobody knew what was happening, but everybody assumed that things were going to go terribly badly wrong. of course, we were, because we were monitoring ourselves, the first to publicly come forward with the first positive case in South Sudan. Now, I happen to know that the Chief Justice and a few other people in South Sudan already had COVID, their families and various other people as well, before we did. But that was used as a weapon against us. You know, it was the foreigners bringing COVID into the country. And we went through a very, very tough time for a few months, trying to sort of wiggle around it. We weren't allowed to move. We weren't allowed to move to different parts of the country without being tested. We went through all these various iterations. And of course, for many of the countries themselves that had contributed troops, they knew that there was COVID right across the country. And of course, they were worried about their troops, because they, at that point, we didn't know what sort of impact it had. We all thought, you know, a lot of people who got it were going to die. So we had a very, very difficult time. And that wasn't just us. That was peacekeepers right across the world had the same sort of thing in various forms. And it took a lot of backwards and forwards with the president, with the vice president, with various ministers, with generals, and etc., to be able to start freeing the system up so we were able to do our work. Because ultimately out there, in particularly in rural areas, there was still conflict going on. It's just that we weren't able to reach a lot of it a lot of the time, because a lot of what we do had to have the consent of the parties. And if you don't have the consent of the parties, then it's very difficult to move against the will of, you only do it a few times, you don't, and you choose your occasions carefully, because to move against the wishes of the government or the wishes of another group. So you generally try and build consensus in terms of what you're trying to do. In terms of the Secretary General's plea, I think what he was trying to say is, look, this is obviously a pandemic. It's bigger than all of us. It doesn't matter whether you're Riek Machar or you're Salva Kiir, or you're president or whatever, or you're a farmer from wherever. You have just as much chance of getting COVID as anybody else, and why not have let's have a peace agreement while we have that pandemic. I just think that it was a great idea, but it just didn't get traction. I think the forces of the local forces overcame the good idea of trying to have a COVID ceasefire. Unfortunately, I mean, there's always you use whatever you can get to get ceasefires, and so unfortunately he wasn't able to succeed. But anyway,
yes. So Deborah Williams says, do you use trained people from the country in which you operate to negotiate the peace agreement, or help you negotiate peace agreement, or does the UN use negotiators, its own negotiators with translators?
Both, and it depends on what level. We sometimes it works better ourselves, where we are seen as impartial and we're seen as neutral, and we come in and we still have an element of gravitas as being the UN, and sometimes that has a bigger impact. We use translators in South Sudan. It's kind of interesting that most the people speak their local language, and the next language they speak most widely is Arabic, and then after that English. But English is amongst educated people is widely spoken. But we also use local people. We've used obviously local government officials, but also religious groups that and ministers. It's being a largely Christian country. It's got the local church, both the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, Presbyterian Church that are big there. They are very good partners to partner up with, and we did that a lot. Interestingly, one very positive thing about in South Sudan was that Muslim and Christian populations were pretty much invisible. You wouldn't know. I mean, other than knowing somebody's name, you wouldn't know whether they were Christian or Muslim. And when you went to where I went to a particular town, where you would often meet religious leaders, and they would introduce themselves. This is Bishop so and so, the Catholic bishop. This is so and so, the Anglican bishop. This is the Muslim cleric. This is the Presbyterian. It was almost like there was no distinction between. They all treated themselves equally. And if you started a meeting, you always started a meeting with a Christian prayer and a Muslim prayer before you kicked off. That was very, very important for people to set the tone right. So using religious leaders and some others that had some gravitas in the area, it just sort of depended on what the level was and what the circumstances were, and on how we best use it. And sometimes, actually, to be honest, all we needed to do was just to provide the space.
Yeah.
We rented the hall. I mean, I know this sounds ridiculous. We rented the hall. We provided some money for accommodation and food and lunches and dinners, and people came together and did their own thing. They just needed it's not so different from the Security Council. At the end of the day, the UN's really a space that is where everybody comes to discuss things. And what we did was provided a space for different groups to come together and have it out themselves. And all we did was stood on the sidelines and watched and made sure that they didn't run out of food or water or whatever, but were able to continue talking until they came to a point where they were happy enough to walk away.
Okay, Tony again says, are New Zealand, Australian, and Fijian peacekeeping forces in the Sudan, or have they ever been in the Sudan? And have you ever worked with them in the past?
Not Fijians. Yes, Fijians are in South Sudan in the policing. I don't think there were any in the military, but they were certainly in the policing. In fact, the head of somebody I promoted, she came in as the deputy head of the policing unit, and was able to promote her to the commissioner for police in our operations. So she did a great job. She was Fijian. And then I pushed very, very hard for her, and she's now in New York as, I think, the deputy of the entire security apparatus for the UN. So she's done very, very well, Inesi. So yeah, I'm very, very pleased for her, and I was really happy that she was able to step up. New Zealanders, Australians, there's I think 12 to 15 Australians at officer level who are providing work inside the headquarters. New Zealanders, there are, I think, 3. There might only be 2 now. And then when I became the SRSG, the special representative there, New Zealand put a military person in my office. It was something that I originally didn't ask for, but actually, having spoken to a lot of people once I got there, realized that having a military person gave me a liaison with the military component of the mission, and made things work much more smoothly. Mm-hmm. So that happened, and so New Zealand put that person up every 6 months. I got a new New Zealander coming in at lieutenant colonel level. To help provide that liaison, which was actually really, really, really useful. One of the interesting things that happened was as the conflict sort of heated up a bit, a lot of the white Western nations pulled their people out of the more far-flung bases across the country and brought them into Juba, which basically left a lot of the African and Asian contingents out there. And we fought really hard against that, because it became pretty obvious what was actually happening. So, and I won't go through the countries, but I mean, But yeah, they pulled themselves back into Juba thinking that it was safer. Ironically, I don't think it actually was safer. It's probably more just as safe where they were.
Mhm.
But when you're looking at it from, you know, Berlin or London or Washington or wherever, or Canberra, I mean, it looks, you know, more. And we fought very, very hard against that, because as I said, the last thing I want to do is see Western countries all swanning around Juba, and all the African and Asian contingents all out in the sticks. You know, that's not right. But anyway, there was an ongoing competition to try and get that to work, but it was partially successful.
Got a question here from Marion. How is compatibility within the UN for operational purposes, that is in terms of equipment, communications, and does this need improving? I guess this goes to the heart of, you know, your coordination, communication type question.
Yeah, it's communications in a peacekeeping operation. You don't quite realize how many different channels of communication there are, because, you know, there's obviously the formal communication, but then of course you've got the Indian who's the colonel in such and such a place in Juba, communicating with his Indian counterpart in another part of the country, is communicating with Delhi, is communicating with New York. I mean, I'm just using India as an example, but I mean, every single country in the mission had this vast degree of communications going in all different directions. And you have to just acknowledge that, because you can't stop it. It's happening. Emails and various other things, snap phones and ordinary phones, you know, made that very easy. The most important thing was to just ensure that there was a commonality of understanding of what we were trying to do. And as I said before, a commonality of the fact, from a troops point of view, that what they were there for was to be out and doing their role, protecting civilians. But I made the point over and over and over to various people, various groups in various countries that came through constantly. We had delegations from countries who had troops in South Sudan. That a peacekeeping operation is not an operation of troops. It's a political operation with peacekeeping enablers. Mm-hmm. You can't have it the other way around. It doesn't work. I mean, it has to be driven by politics. It has to be driven by reconciliation and the desire and the demand for peace. And the advantage you have with peacekeepers is that once you have that established in a place, then you can start moving your pieces around, if you like, to be able to sustain and uphold that. But you can't do it the other way around. You can't just move a peacekeeping operation or a peacekeeping company into a particular area and expect something to work. It doesn't happen like that. And too often, largely service people see it as a military operation and not as a political operation. Mm-hmm. And because you've got 15,500 troops, it must be a military operation. It's not. The few dozen that are doing the politics, and in fact, the sharp end of the operation, and not the military complex that, you know, comes in behind it.
Great. Are there any other questions? I don't have any more on chat. If anybody, we've got a couple of minutes left before I ask Richard to give a vote of thanks. If I can't see anyone, before Richard does, David, I'd just like to personally thank you for being here with us. Thank you for being an excellent student of mine at Canterbury University a few years ago. But more importantly, thank you a lot for your minute grasp of these operations, and for your political nous and ability to understand that peacekeeping is at heart a kind of a political and not a military operation. That's a takeaway for me from this. And I'd like to call on Richard Jackson now to give you the final vote of thanks.
David, yes, it falls upon me to offer a vote of thanks. It occurred to me as I was listening to you that, it's kind of symbolic that you're coming in from Aruba to a meeting chaired by our erstwhile chairman in Brisbane to an audience mostly in New Zealand, talking about an issue related to South Sudan. This seems to be, sort of symbolic of the interdependent, multilateral kind of world we're in. But it's also indicative of the way in which the values that you are working for and the values that our trust represents in the figure of Archibald Baxter have resonance for people everywhere around the world, that people want to live in peace and they want to live without the threat of violent warfare. And yeah, so it's just totally perfect that you've been able to come in and speak to us tonight. And on behalf of the audience and on behalf of the trust, we're extremely grateful to have listened to you. I feel like we could have listened to you all night. Your anecdotes and your stories and your insights, just so interesting. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal. I was particularly impressed with the way in which you managed to bring in that sort of granular, local, personal sets of insights and anecdotes, but then also relate that to a broader macro analysis of the international system and the international peacekeeping processes that you're a part of. As Kevin said, we're delighted and proud and grateful that you're out there working for peace in these capacities, and we really want to wish you well in that. And thank you again for speaking to us tonight on this occasion. And we wish you fair winds and safe sailing until we meet you again in person. Thank you again.
And there's spontaneous applause from everywhere. David.
Many thanks, Richard, and thank you very much, Kevin, once again for giving me the opportunity to speak. And obviously, some of your lectures had some sort of an impact on me from where I've been able to go. I was just saying to Kevin, I think I went to his 40th birthday party when I was doing my masters in Canterbury. So that was a few years ago. So it's nice to come back on a boat in Aruba before we set sail in a couple of days for Colombia. So yeah, thank you very much and all the very best. Cheers.
And thank you all for coming. And next year there'll be the 10th Baxter lecture. You've set a cracking pace here, David, for all of us in terms of the future here. But once again, many thanks for being there and for doing all the work you've done and for being such an inspiring individual for all of us. And as Valerie just mentioned to me, you're coming to us probably from the middle of the night, are you? What time is it with you?
Yeah, it's about 3 in the morning, I think.
Oh, God. Oh, no, we better let you go. Okay. Thank you all and cheers. And thank you all for your good questions.
All right. Here we are.